Okay, hopefully you've already watched the first tree lecture video. This one is slightly more in depth. That one's more about the general kind of shape of trees, and this one is looking a little more in depth, particularly at their bark and their roots. Okay, so as I say in the last video, whenever you're starting a sketch, particularly when you're starting an observational sketch, but this applies to pretty much all kinds of drawing, you want to start with a light graphite, a light pencil sketch of whatever it is you're doing. So in our case, here is a light pencil sketch to begin our tree. So as you can see, you are going to sketch out the exterior contours of the tree and also any of the larger interior shapes or more noticeable lines and divisions, and maybe some of the branches, as some of the branches are sticking out, and kind of a little bit of the upper root structure. As you can see, it connects with the ground. In this example, I'm going through and I am ultimately drawing the tree and all of its texture in ink. You on your assignments don't necessarily have to draw in ink. You can continue to use graphite. I think that the precision of the ink looks nice, especially for textural drawing. In drawing one, I kind of combine texture and pen and ink drawing in the modules. Okay, so anyway, you're going to start with a light pencil, 2H, something like that, to lightly draw in the exterior contours of your tree and in the major linear divisions within the contours. So generally, when you're starting to add in the texture and the bark, a kind of closer examination of what the surface of the tree looks like, you want to start at the base of the trunk. And the first thing you're going to do is define the direction of the bark growth. Does it seem like it kind of leans in along the roots and then heads up? Does it seem like it kind of wraps around the tree? Does it seem like it's going straight up? Whatever the direction is, you want to get a sense in linear terms of direction. And if you've had foundations of design or 2D design or art foundations, it's called different things at different places. But if you've had the beginning level art class, one of the things that you know that you talk about when you're talking about line is direction, is orientation. What way is it headed and what way does it imply movement? So when we're looking at the surface texture of something like a tree, we want to look at what direction it seems like the surface texture, in this case the bark, is going. So that's one of the first steps after you've got your basic contour lines drawn, is to figure out what way the bark tends to lay on the tree, okay? You're also going to look at the general lines and shape of the individual little kind of flakes of bark and start sort of generalizing what those look like, because we want to use line and shape to imitate the texture of the bark once we figure out which direction we're orienting it, right? Using these continuous kind of wandering lines where you're kind of using a very loose form of circulism where you're just kind of meandering these lines in, that helps kind of create a greater pattern to then work back into later and create more detail. You can also do small little shapes within those wandering lines. Practicing these strokes, practicing these wandering lines, if you're not comfortable applying them right away, is fine. You can also do them with graphite before you go back over them with ink, or you can jump right in with ink. It's fun to experiment. This is why we have that big pad of newsprint to do kind of experimental work before we go directly into our sketchbooks. Okay, so you're going to continue with the base of the tree, and you're going to keep in mind a couple of things. The direction of the stroke of the lines and shapes, which we already talked about. They should follow the pattern of the tree bark and kind of wrap the form of the tree. And some bark is kind of wonky. It kind of like leans out and wraps around, and some just sort of seems to go straight vertical. So just really spend some time in the observational part of drawing and really look at your tree and see what the bark looks like it's doing. The second thing is to consider value, to consider the light areas and consider the dark areas. Where is your light source, and what areas do we see being exposed to light more than others? And then and vice versa, what areas are more shaded and are more shadowy? So you want to give the bark dimension by darkening some of the lines and shapes in your shading pattern, as you can see in this example. And this seems very obvious, but trees are not flat, right? So if you simplify a tree form to the very basics, it comes down to kind of a lollipop form. Maybe it's round, maybe it's canonical, maybe it's a little bit like a dome, half of a dome, but it's like that on top of a stick. So like we talked about in the first tree lecture, think about the general shape, but also think about the fact that that shape is a form. It is voluminous. It has volume, right? Each form has a highlighted side and a shadow side and has a drop shadow behind it. So think about that when you're thinking about your form, where your light source is and what that does in terms of the three-dimensionality of the tree that you're looking at. So keep that thought in mind, and that'll help you place the strokes to build a believable three-dimensional object. If you simplify the form of a tree, what do you have? A cylinder. It might be a really weird, warped, crazy-looking cylinder, but basically tree trunks are cylindrical 98.5% of the time, right? Okay, so think about how you shade a cylinder. When you have a light source hitting it, and we'll get into this more when we talk about value, but you're going to have your highlight where the light hits it, then you're going to have the full range of value and then a drop shadow. So if you look at my cylinder here and then you compare it to my tree, you can see that where the light hits on the cylinder is also where the lightest area of the tree is. So just keep that form, that basic form in mind when you're thinking about how light is going to affect the dimension of your tree drawing. And don't forget about the root structure. They also have their own shadow and light areas and shadowed and highlighted sides. They cast their own drop shadows, right? Because they're basically just little half cones on their side. So as the light hits them, they have their own little kind of hills and valleys that are created there. So think about those in terms of light source too, right? It's not going to be 100% consistent with the light source hitting your main cylinder, your main trunk of your tree. Continue adding texture to your tree, and at this point you want to pay attention also to the direction of the strokes, which we've been watching the whole time, and also think about how that surface is changing. If the surface curves, then we need to have the strokes bend too. So if you come to an area like what we have here that's kind of a knot, like a big knot in the bark, make sure that you have your textured bark around it kind of curving around where that knot comes up, and think about the kind of shadowing that happens when you have that uneven surface, okay? You want to work in the darker tones along the layout of the tree. So the outline is going to be darker, usually, depending on where your light source is, than the middle part of the tree. You don't want to outline the tree with a solid, continuous line, because that's not how things are in reality. So you want to just kind of build up you want to darken the texture closer to the edges. After darkening the sides of the tree, you can add small angled strokes to kind of build out the shadowed areas along the bark, in the edges, and the trunk. Then you're going to start defining some of the more fine details in the bark. So if your tree has knots, like this tree in our example, you want to kind of save those aside for later because they're a little weird, and they kind of tend to follow a little bit of a different pattern in terms of value than the rest of the tree. So if they're large and raised bumps, they're covered with bark, but sometimes the bark has a different texture than the rest of the tree, so that's something to observe. Also, while you're looking at your tree and all its different imperfections and knots and bumps and branches, you want to think about that the level at which you're looking at it affects the value, right? So if you're standing, your eye level is going to be higher than if you're sitting. And basically, when you're looking at this, your eye level will be somewhere in the middle. You're not going to be way up at the top. You're not going to be right all the way down at the bottom. So all the details and bumps that are below your eye level, you will see them from the top side, and everything that is above your eye level you will see from the bottom. So here's a sliced cylinder kind of handout to demonstrate that. So just think about perspective. And this goes back to what I have said a couple times already in lectures, and will continue to say over and over and over again this semester, which is draw what you see, not what you know. And if you're practicing good observation, you'll notice that the things below your eye level look different than the things above your eye level. Okay, just a thing to keep in mind. Notice that the bumps have a light side, which is facing the light source, of course, and a dark side, which is the shaded area. Look at the texture of the bark on those bumps and the direction it grows, and use very fine strokes, fine meaning thin, meaning lighter, strokes for the lid areas. Apply shadows with thicker strokes and small angled hatching. Now, this is written as if we're all drawing in pen, which maybe some of you are going to draw with graphite instead. If you're drawing with graphite, use a harder pencil that has a lighter value for the lighter areas, okay? The further up the tree you go, the further it is away from the viewer. To show that, you need to decrease the amount of details in the bark texture. This is something we're going to talk about later when we talk about perspective, but the term is atmospheric perspective. The further away something is from you, the less clear it becomes. You want to also work on your branches and other details. You want to use shading and value to show which parts are further away and position behind the tree. And you want to keep in mind the whole time, and especially when you're finishing, the position of the light source. Everything should be consistent throughout the drawing. Other than creating texture, the shading part is just like shading simple geometric forms, like cylinders and spheres. Okay, so this gives you a little more in-depth look at creating the bark for your tree. And then the last thing is, if you're drawing in ink, go ahead and erase your pencil lines. If you're drawing in pencil, you don't want to erase your pencil lines. That's your whole drawing, right? Okay. You can go back and erase areas if you are drawing in pencil to add highlights, to add lighter value. Okie dokie.